This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and my 2 cents. What I'm commenting on today is something that I didn't think I'd have to comment on anytime soon. Some websites, based on rumors, are saying that Zach Snyder was fired before he left filming of Justice League. And I have only one thing to say about that. Of course he was. You have to be kidding me that this is something that people are actually wondering about. I have 2 reasons why I think this is the case. The first is that as the brains behind DC Cinematic Universe, he's going to get the blame. And keep in mind, there are lots of factors involved here. I think Warner Brothers was/is a bigger problem than Zach Snyder is, to be totally honest. I think his vision for the DCEU was terrible, but he didn't do that on his own. I think the problems with the DCEU can, quite fairly in fact, be laid at the feet of Zach Snyder. He was, after all, the person behind it, the brain behind the DCEU, if you will. But it was such a problematic thing in that it existed only, at least it seemed to me, to exist only in contrast to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, Marvel movies had humor. They weren't funny, by the way. They weren't comedy. Some people say that, and that's just nonsense. But they did have elements of humor, be it situational humor. Well, it typically was situational humor. It wasn't in anything in the way of pratfalls, like a Three Stooges episode or something. But there was humor and lightheartedness at times. By contrast, the DCEU was humorless. People didn't even seem to smile at all. The Marvel Cinematic Universe had things that happened during the day. The DCEU happened, for the most part, at night. It was murky. It was unattractive. It was ugly on the whole. And this is not tenable. How that anyone could listen to this and see these films and think that this would work as a long-term venture is just insane. Now, obviously, I'm speaking from hindsight, but in the formation to it, someone had to have noticed this. It was just ugly and murky and dark, and it was too serious. Everything was serious. You can't have people, if you can't have people laugh at something, if you can't have them smile, it devalues the seriousness. The seriousness becomes a thing in and of itself, as opposed to a response to a particular situation or a reaction to something. And it becomes meaningless. So the DCEU was painted into a corner from the get-go. Warner Brothers deserves as much as the animus as he does, if not more, because they should have shot down some of these ideas. But they just let him run with it, and he ran it into the ground. That's not all on Snyder. But again, he was at the helm. That's what captains do. They go down with the ship. Another reason why Zach Snyder was obviously fired was that they can't seem to control costs at the DCEU. Movies tended to be very expensive, at least in comparison to those from Marvel. Justice League cost, with reshoots by the way, cost at least $300 million, which is insanely expensive. While, by contrast, the movie that was competing with it from Marvel, and I use competing with it in the sense of release in a similar period of time. The producers of these movies may not be thinking, oh, we're going to be competing with Marvel or DC or whatever, but that's pretty much what happens. So let's be adult and just deal with that. The movie that Marvel released at that same time was Thor Ragnarok. It cost $170 million to produce, if I recall. Earned almost $900 million. By contrast, Justice League cost somewhere in the ballpark of $300 million to produce and earned, I believe, just over $650 million. Some people call that not a failure, not a box office flop. I don't see how they do that. But in any case, It cost significantly more to produce, and it earned significantly less. This is a trend with Zack Snyder produced movies for the DCEU. Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice cost somewhere in the ballpark of $200 to $225 million. Same thing for Man of Steel. Comparable Marvel movies don't tend to be as expensive, and that's important because the less a movie costs to produce, the quicker the odds are it's going to become profitable. So he can't seem to manage money, and I don't get it, because on screen they certainly don't look any more visually impressive than what Marvel does. So why these movies are so expensive when produced by Warner Brothers and directed by Zack Snyder, I have no idea. But it's one of the issues that makes it very apparent to me that this guy had to be cut loose. Again, his vision, or lack thereof, his movies are, I don't want to say overpriced, that's not fair, but they're certainly more expensive than competitors' movies. And the sinker, and perhaps most important of all, they're less profitable. So they cost more to produce, and they make less money than comparable Marvel movies. So it seems fairly obvious to me that Zack Snyder was fired. I mean, taking into account some of the things I mentioned, how could they possibly have kept him on? Some people in Hollywood have a tendency to fail upward. This is pretty much what I think David Goyer does. He writes and produces films that don't do very well or that are very divisive, and he moves on to even more projects, oftentimes in that same genre. And he becomes almost, for a certain element, the comic book guy. If you're making a comic book movie or television show, you go to David Goyer. Never mind things like Blade Trinity, which was a clusterfuck. You go to David Goyer. He fails upward. It's really weird, and I can't stand it, but it is what it is. So that Zack Snyder was fired from Warner Brothers prior to leaving Justice League not only makes sense to me, but I would ask why he was not fired sooner. After Man of Steel underwhelmed, again, a pattern, but as far as I'm aware, it wasn't a financial failure. I think it earned somewhere in the ballpark of, I want to say, just over $600 million on a $225 million budget. It's not an incredibly large return on investment, but it's not bad. But so I would have been certainly on watch after Man of Steel. Again, due to its middling profit and its divisiveness. It's a comic book movie, for Christ's sakes. Does it really need to alienate people? It's just so unnecessary and just so ridiculous and part of the problem. So I would have been on watch for that. Probably wouldn't have changed. I probably would have tinkered with his vision if I were Warner Brothers executives. But he probably would have been able to direct Batman v Superman. But having seen that movie, that would have been it. He would have been done. I would not have had him directing Justice League. Despite there being bonuses for Kevin Tsujihara and Toby Emmerich being tied to it being released at a certain period of time, screw that. That movie needed to have been stopped. And Zack Snyder needed to have been removed from that movie. It should have been a Joss Whedon production from the get-go, or someone else other than Zack Snyder. Instead, we get this Frankenstein mess of a movie that's neither fish nor fowl and just alienates people for different reasons. So, this is Brian from Screenfiles.com and my 2 cents. Totally mystified why people are mystified that Zack Snyder was fired. Peace.